Hi, hello, welcome back. I'm Yang Lan. I'm very privileged to serve as the moderator for the following and the last session of today's forum, which is a big challenge for me. As you can see, we have powerhouse on stage, and each from a different perspective. So as the theme of the last session about the future of global economic relations, I believe there's a lot of uncertainty. And equally, I believe there's a lot of uncertainty what will come out of these sessions of discussion. So as a moderator, I'm very excited to explore this topic, and also maybe we can start by asking our panelists to give a few remarks of your observations and takeaways of this whole day's forum. What are the interesting stuff, and what could be the new questions cast from today's discussions? And also, let me introduce our panelists. And as you can see, we have all these chairs on stage, and the Dean, Mr. Chen Yingyi, and the Dean, Mary Zhanel, have generously give up their opportunity to speak again and leave all the seats to our distinguished panelists. We're very fortunate to have them. Seated beside me is Professor Lawrence Lau from Chinese University of Hong Kong. And then Mr. Martin Wolf, the Chief Economics Commentator of Financial Times. And then, of course, we have our Nobel laureate, Professor Joe Stiglitz. We have Professor Gerard Holland, who is from the University of California at Berkeley. And then we have, let me see, on the table. Oh, I think Yupen. Let me have that, because obviously I have an old list of names. Doesn't matter. We are very open to changes. And Mr. Yupeng Huai, the chairman of Nanhai Corporation. We also have, let me introduce Mr. Sun Zhe first, who is the adjunct senior research scholar in the Faculty of International and Public Affairs, and the co-director of the China Initiative at Columbia CEPA. And then we have Jacob Liu, the former United States Secretary of the Treasury and the visiting professor of International and Public Affairs at CEPA. So why don't I open the floor by asking a few of you who would volunteer to make a summary or give us your sharing of some of the observations from this morning's and this afternoon's discussions. Maybe Professor Lau, from you?
I wasn't here this morning, so maybe it's better.
Neither was I, so I was not in the position to tell. So maybe, yeah.
Maybe I'll volunteer, since Joe came in after the first session. The session this morning was a very interesting and good discussion of globalization, the relationship between technology and trade, and what's driving the anxiety that we see in the Western world, at least, and talking a bit about the contrast between the experience in the West and in the emerging economies. I think what I took away from the conversation was that we have to acknowledge the enormous benefits that have come from globalization, but we also have to acknowledge that there are some imperfections in the systems in our countries where the benefits of globalization and technological innovation have not reached all of the people in our countries, and we have to try and separate those factors. Technology is a big driver, separate and apart from trade. And within an economy that's growing, making sure that the benefits of growth reach people who are working and middle class, as well as people who own the assets, is very important. We discussed in the second session exchange rate, regulation, and competition. And I guess what I took away from that is a core belief I have that government has to make sure that there's a stable foundation for making progress going forward, making sensible policy, and we went into detail on different sub-issues. I think the discussion that we just had in here on promoting innovation is about how to put it all together for the future, how to grow the economy so that there is more to share how to have an environment where government and business are working cooperatively so there's a flexible environment for that kind of innovation. I think sitting here as we do today at a moment when in so many parts of the world there is anxiety that's expressing itself in the political process through elections and votes that are creating a real risk to the kind of ongoing stability of the liberal economic order that we have all grown up with. Taking the lessons that we've discussed here to heart is very important. If we don't figure out how in our own systems to have the benefits of a broad global system felt more broadly, it becomes more challenging to have confidence that that system will survive. And if we all separate, there are both economic consequences to that, but there are also real geopolitical consequences, which I think lead to insecurity broadly. The optimist in me looks at the discussions we have on things like innovation, and the horizons are not set and limited, they grow. And we have to figure out how to take the benefits of that and distribute it through our incomes policies, our tax policies, our education, training, our infrastructure, things that we can do in our own countries. And as somebody who has struggled to do that in my own country, that's not a small task. But it is something that if we don't succeed at it, it will strain the system that I think has done so much to improve the quality of life in the world.
Thank you very much. So you remain optimistic about the future when innovation or technology will make its own way, right?
I have to confess,
to lead us through it.
I'm a determined optimist because if you engage in public policy with anything other than optimism, you're surely going to fail. You can only succeed if you're an optimist because not everything is going to work out well, but giving up and saying only bad things will happen is throwing up your hands. Okay. So I am by nature and conviction an optimist.
You choose to be optimistic. So Professor Roland, are you as optimistic?
Let me just make a very pessimistic stance. We are now in a major moment of instability, and right now the US government is a major source of instability in the world. Right now, we have to recognize that. That's very important. Now, that being said, we just don't know what's going to happen. So if I want to say something useful, I want to think, if I were in a situation like the 1930s or during World War II, the massacre, how do we think about the future of the international economic order, international political order? Because whatever comes out of this instability, I think as was said repeatedly this morning, there's no going back on globalization. Now, a lot of damage can be done. There can be wars, there can be, many, many bad things can happen. But I think it's certainly our duty to think of, what kind of principles should prevail when, things are better, after things stabilize. And I just like to say two things here. One, which it sounds a little bit abstract, but I think there should be in all countries in the world, especially in all major countries, people should recognize the idea that there is no such thing as absolute sovereignty. No such thing as absolute sovereignty. Now, the post-World War II international order has brought, amazing things. The UN, peace, trade, etc., globalization. But the international architecture is failing in many ways. The UN, WTO, they're just not strong enough. And major participants in this order, a very large part of the population still think there is something as absolute sovereignty. In the US, you have people who are willing to go to war or take weapons against the world government as being the devil. But actually, given the externalities that we have in the world, given all the problems, we need something like a world government, and we actually have to debate about it, and the world's institutions that we've created ourselves in post-World War II are not strong enough. So in the UK, same thing, behind the Brexit vote, there's the idea that countries should have right to absolute sovereignty. In France, there's an increasing fringe of the population who think that France should have the right to absolute sovereignty. Now, in a world where you have countries who think that you should have absolute sovereignty, that just leads to conflict. China is a little bit different. China has always had this principle of the absolute right to self-determination of countries, and that's still something that's very important. But China has been a pretty active participant in the world order. But even China has to decide, whether, they abandon this idea of absolute sovereignty. And I think that's a principle that's very important. Germany, that was one of the major culprits in the, in the 20th century, abandoned that. You see very few citizens in Germany who think that there should be something like absolute sovereignty. Now, this sounds abstract, but I think to live together peacefully in a world where we prosper, etc., there needs to be a set of common values. And that leads me to my second point. For the foreseeable future, even after whatever happens, you will have different political systems in the world. One may think what one may think, but many people think that the Chinese political system is relatively stable, will continue to be stable for a while. We don't know what's going to happen in other countries, but it's clearly that, democracy is very, very strong in the world, very, very strong. So you will have coexistence of democratic countries, non-democratic countries. And to live peacefully, to prosper, to live together, each country has to accept that there are different countries, provided we all accept a common set of rules. I think that's very important. And that speaks, I think, very strongly to the relationship between the US and China. The US has to recognize, China as it is, in a way. And also China should understand that it's the right of any other country to denounce human rights violations, because human rights are universal. Denouncing human rights violation is not an interference in a country's own affairs, provided it is not followed by direct interferences. And I think these principles, should be broad principles on which one should agree to have more stability, given what we see today in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Stiglitz, well, from a historic point of view, what's happening and what will happen in the foreseeable future? Do you think that the globalization is just taking a hiccup but will come back strong later? Or is it a point, a turning point in history that we should rethink about the rules and the process of globalization?
Well, I think what is happening in the United States is going to have long-term effects. Trump has reminded everybody that borders really do matter, and I think that's going to change attitudes about international agreements, and it's going to have a very destructive role. Now, I agree very strongly with what Jack said, that about the importance of the post-World War II order in a whole set of areas: economic growth, the spread of liberties, a whole set of changes that have occurred. Let me be for a moment optimistic before I get pessimistic. The optimistic point is that partly under the influence of the United States, a set of institutions like the IMF, the WTO, the World Bank, a whole set of regional development banks were created. I'm not sure they could have been created without the influence of the United States. But now, even though they're not perfect, and I don't think that they're far from perfect, and I've spent a lot of time criticizing them, they are important, and the changes that we've seen, for instance, in the IMF over the last 10 years has shown how robust these institutions are. I think that they will continue with or without the United States. So I think that that the strength, the rest of the world recognizes how important globalization is, and I think President Xi made that speech that's been quoted a lot at Davos, but it's more than that. I think that there is a widespread understanding of the benefits, the kind of benefits that Jack spoke of. And with or without the United States, these institutions will continue. I think in some ways they may get the fact that the United States is withdrawing will make the commitment of the rest to make sure that these work even stronger. It's not the way I would have liked the world to have evolved, but it is the way that things are going. On the less optimistic note, it's not just that the benefits of globalization have not been equally shared. It's actually that some groups have probably been made worse off. That the nature, the way globalization has worked, has weakened the bargaining power of workers and probably contributed, not the only factor and probably maybe even the most important factor, but it has contributed to the weakening, the growing inequality in our society. And so that makes the challenge of responding. It's not just redividing the pie in a more equitable way. It's really redesigning the system. But the problem is only partly with globalization and with the way the rules, I think, of the global rules have been done, which I think too often have advantaged corporations, especially in the advanced countries. But the real problem is within countries like the United States, where we have a regressive tax system. I mean, it's unbelievable. But we have a tax system in which those at the top pay a lower percentage of their income than those down below. What kind of civilized society has that? We have a bankruptcy law that says that, well, somebody like President Trump can go bankrupt umpteen times. If you're a student and you take out a student loan, you can't discharge your debts except under the extreme circumstances. And if you co-sign a note for your child and your child dies, the parent can't discharge the debt. Now, what kind of a civilized society does that? So to me, we have a very big challenge in the United States, and we're going in the wrong direction. So since we played that vital role for so long in trying to make globalization work, and since the way we've managed things in the United States has been extraordinarily inequitable, and the fact that things are getting worse gives me, I'm an inveterate optimist. I come from the Midwest, where in the United States, which is known for its optimism, I'm, for the first time, rather pessimistic.
Wow, that's overwhelming. Mr. Wolf, do you think globalization is in retreat?
Well, that's certainly a good question. Let me start off. I was interested. I see Jack Lew is taking this opportunity to leave. I fortunately am a commentator, so I've always felt that I'm not only entitled but almost obliged to indulge in pessimism. And there are two reasons for that as a stance. The first is that it's only if you make clear to people how bad things can get that they will think, well, actually, they have to do something. The second reason I do this is that both for me and my readers, life is only full of pleasant surprises. And I prefer pleasant surprises to unpleasant ones, so I prefer to start off with thinking about all the things that could go wrong. And that means that every day I survive, I feel that's a very pleasant surprise. Now, but then, as you point out, this is not the spirit of an entrepreneur, and I'm not an entrepreneur. So in terms of where we are on globalization, I will just focus on two things which I think are complementary to, but don't completely overlap with the very important points that have been made. First, I am absolutely convinced, and have been now for quite a few years, at least since 2007. You could argue it started earlier, in a period of profound global regime transition. And this is at core a transition of power, as all global regime transitions are, but it is also a transition of legitimacy. And and this is associated with, above all, the profound decline in the relative weight and confidence of the West in general and the US in particular. We have been through periods of regime transition with crises of legitimacy before. The most important period in relatively recent history was the interwar period, and as I'd like to point out, this did not go well. And anybody who is confident about how a period of such transition will end up is, in my view, a complete fool. We just do not know how this will end up. It depends on far too many actors, both the rising powers, in this case obviously China, some others, India to a much lesser degree, and the performance and behavior of the declining power. I would say at the moment, and to underline what Joe said, the performance of the declining power has exceeded my worst expectations by at least an order of magnitude. I am not joking. I mean that precisely. 2 or 3 years ago, I was concerned that things were going seriously wrong, but what is happening exceeds my worst expectations by an order of magnitude. And if you don't think that when you look at what's going on in the United States, you simply are not paying attention. So that's the first point I wanted to make. I won't go into all the details of what could happen, but there is essentially a war by the core of the state against the state. Now, the second point I would make, in that context, where are we on globalization? I think the evidence we have, and I've written quite a bit about this, and I'm talking about it tomorrow at the China Development Forum, is not that globalization is in full retreat on what has happened so far, but it has the process of globalization and all the measures we would normally use, that is to say the rise in cross-border financial assets, foreign direct investment, and above all, centrally trade, is that it's essentially halted. And it is halted, I think, mostly so far, there are some exceptions, for 2 reasons. The first reason is not that we've become very protectionist, but that the liberalization thrust has stopped. And this is clearest in trade. So if you think about trade, whether you think these were good or not, measures or not, the last 2 really major world-transforming trade liberalization acts was the Uruguay round, which was essentially completed in 1995, which is now therefore 22 years old, and China's accession of the WTO, which was completed in 2001, and therefore is 16 years old. And all the benefits of that have basically been exhausted. In finance, it's even clearer. We have re-regulated, so there's clearly a halt, not only a halt, but a retreat, a massive reduction in cross-border financial assets. Doesn't worry me much, but that has clearly happened. So the liberalization thrust has halted. Furthermore, by now, I think we have exhausted more or less all the obvious opportunities that were created by that liberalization thrust. So above all in goods, we have disintegrated production chains to a very, very high degree across borders. And if anything, they are now reversing that process, both within China, more of the value chain is going to China, and more of the value chain is also going to the US. So we are seeing a clear cessation of the dynamism of world trade as growth and growth relative to the growth of GDP. And if there isn't a liberalization thrust, I expect that to continue. We will be in an environment of global trade stagnation. And one of the most interesting indicators, not much discussed, I think, outside China, is that the openness of the Chinese economy as measured by trade to GDP has fallen dramatically over the last decade. I mean, it's simply dramatic for a whole host of reasons. That is the background, to, it seems to me, to where we are now. It is clear, and here I'm afraid I am more pessimistic than Joe, that so I'm just going to focus on trade. I could say about FDI, and I could talk about the balance of payments and endless things, but I just focus on the trade side. Nobody knows, as I've already said, exactly what the Americans are going to do. But I think it is as safe as anything you can imagine. We are not going to have some massive global liberalization event for the foreseeable future. It is extremely unlikely in my reading that without the US, anybody else is going to start a major global liberalization event. It is conceivable that the TPP will survive without the US, but it's a pretty big chunk. I don't think the Chinese-led alternative, RCEP, I think it's called, is going to amount to anything, sorry. And the Europeans are out of the business. So there is going to be no major global liberalization thrust. And there is, unfortunately, a very considerable chance that US trade policy, not a certainty because there's a civil war going on in the American administration on this right now, but there is a very considerable chance that the Americans will start a very destructive trade conflicts, and it will be extremely difficult to contain if that has happened. So my view is that anybody who looks at the world now and is an optimist is a hero, but I think it's a good idea to look at the world and be terrified and then think, particularly if you're a China, a great rising power, what the hell can we do to change this trajectory?
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Wolf, for making us quite depressed. But let's take a shift of perspective from the business point of view. Mr. Yu, I want you to give us your insight on what is going to happen. Are you as pessimistic? Are you as concerned and angry about what's happening now?
I'm definitely not angry, as Mr. Wolf. But I think it's going to be a very excited period of time with President Trump, on board now. But I think what Secretary Liu mentioned something this morning. He was saying that one of the major concern for him for the economic prospect is the traditional liberal economic agenda. How is that going to evolve? He was saying that, which is fundamental. What is the things that have been happening in the last 30, 40 years, in fact, maybe 70, 80 years in the world? It has always been a very liberal economic agenda. But with China coming up so strongly, what is that going to happen? And clearly, China has a very different kind of economic agenda. I'm sure that is not liberal. Somebody earlier, I think a gentleman from McKinsey, I think, was mentioning something about Shenzhen. He was saying that Shenzhen, how it became the Silicon Valley of China. And he also mentioned about Hong Kong. Okay, I think Professor Lau and me are both from Hong Kong. And we were clearly know that the problem in Hong Kong now is the totally lack of innovation. And I remember 20 years ago, or not 20, maybe 18 years ago, when the internet bubble was really going strong in Hong Kong. And I believe Yang Lan was part of that bubble also. And we were active in that also. At that time, China has no internet. It doesn't even have computer. It's very, very short of computer at that time. But today, Hong Kong being labeled by the Heritage Foundation as the most free economy in the world, and the government peoples in Hong Kong are very proud of that. Every year they celebrate when Heritage declare that. But at the end of the day, with that kind of freedom, it doesn't have an internet industry whatsoever. All the companies that founded at that time disappear, basically. And why is that? Why China, with such an authoritarian government structure, political structure, why something like that could happen? But people do not really ask that question. I think when we look at the subject of today's forum, the role of the state, And clearly, it is a subject demands a lot of attention. And I've been participating in the economic reform in China in almost my entire adult life. And I have to say that changes are tremendous. And based on what we heard this morning, I would suggest to look at it this way. The future of economic relations globally, clearly, is going to be competition. 30 years ago, China competed it with cheap labor and then have production capacity. Later on, the initial accumulation of capital reached to the stage that China compete with capital. And then in the last, let's say, 10 years, China obviously is competing with technology. And clearly, somebody was mentioning earlier, the top 20 internet companies in the world, I think 7 or 8 of them are from China, and with 11 or 12 from USA and 1 from Japan. There must be a reason. So in the last, let's say, 10 years, technology has been the field where countries compete with each other. China seems to be working out quite well. But what are the subject matter going to be determining competition in the future? I believe it's going to be idea. And idea is going to play a very important part, but nobody talks about the innovation of idea. People will keep talking about idea, technology, process, everything. But innovation of idea, I think, are the most important element in the success of China in the last 30, 40 years. When Deng Xiaoping talked about the liberation of ideas, I mean thinking, and then the economic reform comes after that. And I believe everybody talk about economic reform in China, but they always forget, before that statement, Deng Xiaoping talks about the liberation of thinking. I mean, forget the old way of thinking about things. Do it the new way. I think in technology, why China? Because 10, 15 years ago, I'm sure a lot of people were saying China could not innovate. The reason? Because it's an authoritarian state. It is. It is still an authoritarian state, but it seems the innovation is working in China. But I think even with that, the main element behind it is really the innovation in idea. I've been talking about in a lot of the Tsinghua's debates is that in international politics, the reason China works out pretty well is because they have an alternative thinking. It's different from the alternative fact that's common in USA now. But alternative thinking is an innovation, I believe, because you are not being trapped in the old way of thinking. So China has been doing quite a lot of that. So when we talk about the role of state, and I believe it's much more than just leaving the private enterprise alone. It's a lot more than that, but I don't want to say which part of it that should be left to the state, which part of that leave it to the private enterprise. Being myself has been a private entrepreneur for my whole life, so clearly I won't be supporting the state. But I must say, in China, the experiment of cooperation between the state and the private enterprise has been pretty successful. A lot of people talk about the state-owned enterprise in China, which we work together with sometime. And I must say that there is a role for them. But what role could it be better? Yes. But the partnership between the public sector and the private sector in China, or the role of the state and the role of the private enterprise in China, are pretty unique. I mean, at least in accordance to the textbooks that we read in the West. So I strongly believe if there is going to be something we need to talk about, the future of global economic relationship, innovation of idea, competition among ideas, I think are very, very important. And I believe if we try to ignore that there are different kind of ideas coming up and they're working in practice, and it will be difficult to truly appreciate what had happened in China. So I strongly suggest the role of the state, and in fact, in the role of state for economic growth. I talked to the dean this morning. We're saying that, what about distribution of wealth? Is distribution of wealth is a power, a force for economic growth? I think it is. But the world economy has been too much focused on growth. In the past 3-4 years, China has been shifting from the focus on growth to focus on distribution of wealth. Will that also work to promote growth coming back? So I think there's a lot of things to look at, comparing the USA and China, their experience, comparing Shenzhen and Hong Kong, comparing with technology and idea. I think there's a lot of demand for clarification in this area. The competition among USA and China in the future is not really custom policy, tariff, and all that. I believe idea would probably be the key word for that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yu. And then the question comes to Professor Lau, as also coming from Hong Kong. Could you please share with us your perspective? And also, if you need a few indexes in terms of forecasting the future, what are some of those key elements you are paying attention to?
This is a joke, but if you want to be a good forecaster, you should forecast often. And people will forget that you made mistakes.
And also forecast not beyond 3 years of time.
I actually am a perennial optimist, just like Jack Liu, and maybe a little bit like Joe. I'm optimistic. But I think one of the things about globalization, people talk about deglobalization today, but if you really think about it, it is really a product. Globalization came about because the states agreed to have globalization. WTO is really an organization of states. The market, leave it to the market, it won't come about. Okay? WTO is not a market product. Okay? It is a product of states. I always feel that we need to have both the invisible hand, the market, and the visible hand working together. You just leave it alone to either side, you get in trouble. Okay? Because the natural instinct, if you have a market that's totally left alone, is to have monopolies come up. Right? That is really a natural instinct. And you can see that it will happen. Now, Joe and I actually had this conversation, I think maybe last year, about globalization. You see, the thing about people are now angry about globalization, I think simply because the states did not do their job. Because it is quite clear that participation in globalization benefits everybody. When two countries trade, both countries are exposed to greater consumption possibilities. Now, it is really how you distribute the consumption possibilities that makes the difference. And in principle, there should be enough gain that there are no losers, right? But in practice, there are losers, right? Because the states haven't done a good enough job in taking care of the losers. There are sufficient gains. Now, if you think about China, China is really a major beneficiary of globalization. I think without globalization, without Chinese entry in the WTO, China could not have lifted 500 million people out of poverty. If you really look at the growth, Chinese growth accelerated after 2001. And that is really a major point, is that it's a beneficiary of globalization. But President Trump was half right. But on the other hand, the United States is also a great beneficiary of globalization, because if you look at the price statistics in the U.S., look at non-oil imports of the United States, look at the prices. The prices actually have been declining, okay, since 2001. And it has almost a perfect correspondence with the share of Chinese imports in the U.S. markets. Apparel prices, non-oil prices, they're all related. So the U.S. is actually also a major beneficiary of globalization. It kept the prices.
As a country, but not necessarily different sectors of the
exactly.
population.
But that's right. But that is because the state, has not done its job in redistribution, right? So that's really my first point. My second point has to do with the current exchange rate system. In fact, the current fluctuating exchange rate system was really created by the United States in 1971. Before that, we had a system in which arguably all currencies are more or less equal, right? So there's no need to have one single, reserve currency. But after 1971, it's fluctuating, so everybody is afraid of risk. So they basically, the U.S. dollar has become the most common currency because everyone is ready to accept it. And also it's become the safe haven currency. So whenever there's any problem in the world, anywhere, money flows to the U.S. Right? And so it's actually a very asymmetric system right now. And I really don't think it is in China's interest to really to supplant the U.S. dollar. I don't think renminbi really wants to be like the U.S. dollar because it has many problems. For one thing, if you really want to be a major international reserve currency, you will have to run large trade deficits if you want to benefit from it. If you don't run trade deficits, you don't benefit from being from the seigniorage. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that unless you're really too big to fail, it's very dangerous, very risky to have all the other countries holding your currency and your bonds. They can dump at any time, right? So I think actually what China should be doing is to promote the use of own currency for international settlement. There's really no reason why two countries, let's say China and India, trading, that they need to use the U.S. dollar as an intermediary, right? They should be able to just, trade directly in either the renminbi or in the rupee, right? So and that really reduces transactions costs and reduces exchange rate risk. So I think that actually ought to be the direction. But again, this really takes state intervention. It cannot happen automatically, right? And so that's really my second point. My third point is actually closer to China now, is the following observation. You probably have been hearing this sentence about China is going to let the market play the decisive role, right? I mean, for the last 3-4 years at least, since the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress. I wonder, you ever wonder why it hasn't really happened? And I think the reason is that you also need the visible hand, right? Because the problem is that if you really because the market really doesn't work too terribly well in China. The reason that there's so much excess capacity, right, so many zombie enterprises, is really because behind them, there are the local governments. None of the local governments want their plants to close, right? I mean, like, Martin has a steel plant, I have a steel plant, and we were both struggling. I would do my best to prevent Martin's steel from coming into my jurisdiction. He is doing the same. Now, this is all illegal in China, completely illegal, but it's done all the time. So the market really has no chance of being decisive, unless the government really intervenes and tells, basically, government can say, Larry, I think you should just close your plant and just buy steel from Martin, right? I mean, that is really what has to happen, right? That is really for the government to enforce the law that you cannot have local protectionism. As long as you have local protectionism, it cannot work. So I think I agree that the state really has a very, very important role to play, because otherwise the market cannot in itself work on itself. So let me just stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Lau. So the question goes to Professor Sun. As we can see, there's a lot of tension around China, and also the relationship between China and the U.S. is going through a lot of frictions and the confrontations too. So how do you see the relationship between the two governments is affecting the economic exchange between these two countries and vice versa?
Thank you very much. Let me answer your question first. I define the U.S.-China relations in 4 dimensions. One, what I call the very broad contact. Every day, every year, we have these kind of people going back and forth. We sign a lot of treaties, agreements, climate change, whatever, very broad contact. Second dimension on U.S.-China relations is something like we do have substantial cooperation, in terms of economic cooperation, even political cooperation, anti-terrorism, whatever, So third dimension of U.S.-China relations is what call the competition. Mr. Yu said the Huawei is competing with iPhone, and the two countries are competing in Southeast Asia, trying to win the heart and mind, in strategic sense. The last dimension, limited confrontation. So that's why we see North Korea, we see South China Sea. We hope we can control the crisis. So that's why the President Xi Jinping he proposed, trying to manage the crisis. So that's the basic idea on the U.S.-China relation. But come back to the forum major theme. I'm a political scientist. I would rather pay more attention on the political innovation because we all love pleasant surprise. But we do see a lot of dark clouds in the internet world, the economy, whatever problems we have. Without political innovation, we just simply cannot turn the black cloud into rainbows, into pleasant surprise. So in that sense, I think I would suggest maybe in the future, first issue we might, after I listened this morning the sessions, the first issue maybe we need to talk a little bit more about the international system. For example, the supplementary system, AIIB, over One Belt, One Road. These not purely economic institutions. I think there's a lot of politics involved. There are political decisions to form AIIB. I spoke with one American policymaker, and he explained some of the reasons why the United States at the very beginning is afraid to join the AIIB, because he said, what kind of a decision-making process you're going to have, mechanism you're going to have. If you make decisions, for example, Philippines, Vietnam, these countries, they don't have a good relation with China. They need fund for basic infrastructure, whatever. Are you willing to give them money? Secondly, according to American system, if you make a big decision, you're supposed to allow the NGOs to come and lobby. You need to listen to these labor groups, whatever. But China has passed NGO laws. Are you willing to allow the foreign NGO to come to China to lobby? Are you willing to give them visa? So that's some other reasons. So I think we need to study the rules, what kind of new rules we want to work out. For example, the G20 is a magnificent things. We have what happened in Hangzhou. But same year, these members states, they issue some kind of I remember something like 140 hundreds, something like 140,000 measures to protect their domestic market. So that is, on the one hand, the calling for globalization, liberalization of trade, but on the other hand, they want to protect their own market. So that's something I think we need political innovation, we need innovation of ideas, how can we work together. Second point I want to make, talking about the role of state, I'm a political scientist, we used to have a big debate on the role of state. Either state can be seen as a registered machine. You collect taxes, or smaller is beautiful, but other school of thought think states should play a bigger role. You have to control the market, whatever, play bigger regulatory roles. So I think for use United States, use China as examples, we have a big political operating system. I don't want to call this political reform, but somehow we need to find a way to innovate the operating system to make the state bureaucracies more efficient. And also we have to put some kind of values on it. Are you willing to prefer the economic growth rate or you want to put more emphasis on social justice, like what Hu Jintao in 2006 emphasized, 又好又快, good and fast growth. So that is a different value. And I think they need to think about it, what kind of value you want to encourage. Last point, I want to talk about the state. If you come back to China, because this is talking about state roles in economic growth, China play a big role. I think we missed a point. We always talk about top-down, top designs, but we have to study what in Xi Jinping's ideas, how Xi Jinping want to play out in the economic reform. I think his influence, talking about the political innovation in Xi Jinping's rule, he's influenced by three elements. One is Chinese history, or historical cultural things elements. Second, revolutionary genes, revolutionary elements. You see his anti-corruption campaigns. It's kind of a campaign style. It's some kind of revolutionary elements in it. A third element, I think his personal experience. He worked in Fujian, in Zhejiang, in Shanghai briefly. So I think these three elements influenced him on shaping his ideas, 治国理念, whatever, in doing this kind of economic reforms and also on political innovation at the same time. So my conclusion is we have to study all these things, and if we argue that government yourself is better right now, right? So for both the United States and China facing the same problem. We do have a difficult situation here in China. So I think that if we concentrate on focusing on domestic affairs, and that actually can create some kind of a strategic opportunity for future international or global cooperation in economic growth. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. So you think both governments should be more concentrated on their domestic economy instead of...
It really depends on for example, Donald Trump, he emphasized American first, but he emphasized unfair trade. The United States passed a law in 1988 to put a fair trade law, something like that. But is it willing to apply that American domestic law by American standards to international trade practice? I don't know. So it's really, I think it's come back to the rule-making process.
How about those global governance structures? We had the Bretton Woods Accord with the result as IMF, World Bank, WTO, and then all this whole system of governance. We noticed that during the World Economic Forum, President Xi made a speech advocating for free trade and also the free flow of talent, capital, trade, goods to promote globalization and also to how to make it more inclusive, which make people wonder what kind of role should China play in maybe reshaping or redeveloping the global governance structure. What's your point on that?
I actually have one suggestion. If you think about the IMF, the top person is always a European. Has always been. And the World Bank is always American, and Asian Development Bank is always Japanese. If you really think about it, why should that be the case? It might have been justified in the 50s and 60s. Today, that's totally unjustifiable.
Yeah, right? The G20 actually agreed to change that until it actually came to happen. And then the U.S. administration said, had second thoughts. So I mean, you're right. Everybody that changed until it's about to happen.
Yes, please, Mr. Wolf.
I think that I'm going to. These sorts of discussions are only interesting if there's some disagreement. I'm not going to go into the questions of exchange rates. I disagree somewhat with Professor Lau, but that's not so important. I've always said that when people start off by complaining about who's running these institutions, that shows they really don't have any ideas about what they want to do with these institutions. Now, I've written endlessly, of course, it's ludicrous that the Americans run the World Bank, and my God, they run it badly. And the Europeans run the IMF, And the only thing one can say is they run it marginally less badly than the Americans have run the World Bank. So I'm completely happy with having people from the rest of the world, but not just because they are Chinese or Indian. I wouldn't mind if it was somebody from a country of no great importance as a country, who happen to be very good and have very good ideas. So I believe it should be a global competition. However, open global competition, we should certainly agree with this. But the fundamental issues that have been raised here are much deeper. And I think there are two. The biggest one is the rebellion against global governance as such, which was discussed so well. The basic idea of the system that was created after the war, very imperfectly, is that it was necessary for governments of the world to cooperate in order to achieve essential public goods that they could not achieve on their own. And that meant accepting that I don't see this as a constraint on sovereignty. It is a valid expression of sovereignty because purely national sovereignty cannot achieve these ends. What we are seeing now in important countries, and I think we would agree the US is an important country, is by at least the administration and substantial elements in Congress, a fundamental rejection of this basic principle. Now, if that becomes a global process, the structure of global governments will collapse. Now, Joe says it can go on without the US, and to some modest degree it can, but it will be pretty difficult to run climate change acceptably, the global monetary system acceptably, and I would say trade, let alone security issues, without the US being centrally involved. The current US administration has, to give you one example, outside our sphere, indicated at certain points that it doesn't really care at all if there is limitless nuclear proliferation. Well, if that becomes the policies, where does global security end up? So the first big question is the restoration of the principle of global cooperative governance. China has a gigantic role to play in this. And the second question, of course, is how do you make these regimes work better than they have, which obviously can only happen if there's a legitimacy to this. We've made a minor progress on climate change, but it is dramatically imperfect. I can only begin to discuss it. The trading system isn't too bad, but its integration with the global monetary system has been a disaster, and I think a big cause of our problems. And on the security side, which is pretty damn important, we have basically no working structures at all. So we clearly need a lot more global governance at exactly the time when global governance is becoming highly illegitimate. So I will be very happy if we got rid of Europeans from running the IMF and Americans from running the World Bank, but I honestly think that's a second or third order issue. The challenges we confront now are much deeper. And I would stress, as the great rising power of the world, China does inescapably have a central role to play in these discussions.
As a stakeholder, huh? Professor Ronald.
So just like to make a few remarks here, because indeed, you know, there's the immediate future, there's what can happen, but let's say in an optimistic scenario where you know, the US doesn't go nuclear on trade, not talking about, you know, going directly nuclear, you know, there could be, you know, room for negotiations with China. I think this is, you know, if heads can keep cool, there are clearly, you know, advantages. The US has made mistakes before. I think you know, not involving China in the TPP, in my view, was a mistake. The whole attitude towards the AIIB, the US has ridiculed itself, you know, with respect to the rest of the world. So there have been mistakes. One mistake that, you know, can be corrected to the extent that there is a clear negotiation is that one thing I find ludicrous is the fact that neither the US nor the EU is willing to recognize that China is a market economy, you know, in the eyes of the WTO. And then when they come up with criteria, you'd say that, well, if you take those criteria that they take very seriously, that mostly the American lobbyists or the European lobbyists, that they look at, 50 years ago, 80% of the world's economies wouldn't have fulfilled those, in terms of currency, in terms of the role of the state, in terms of transparency, etc. And even today, so that wouldn't be. And you see clearly that the only reason, they're not willing to do it has to do with special interests. It's only related to special interests. I think any reasonable view of China is that if China is not a market economy, it's a special market economy, but there are all sorts of special market economies, then what is? But I think that, in a negotiation where, that might be given to China, there could be progress on, bilateral investment treaty and a whole lot of things that are on the agenda where there could certainly be agreements. I'd just like to make another point, which is partly orthogonal, but which I think is important. One reason for the hostility to TPP, TTIP, etc., has to do with the way this is negotiated. And here I will join some of Joe's criticism. So, I'm actually coming from Belgium, and I'm a Walloon, and I was actually quite proud of my former colleague who was for a while blocking it, not because he was against, but because of the non-transparent way through which these treaties are negotiated, where then countries are asked simply to ratify, and where a lot of negotiations are purely between special interests. And one important clause there was the investment arbitration clause. Now, it's not the case. So as a serious economist, I would say that these things are actually very important, that with global value chains, protecting investments of different countries are very important. It's not just about, intellectual property rights. These things are really, really important. What is not correct is that to think that private arbitration should decide against, sovereign governments, and I think that's wrong. So here clearly the WTO should play a bigger role. There should be commonly decided arbitration courts, and that's actually what the dispute was about in Wallonia. It was not about rejecting it. It was about making it more accountable, more transparent, and that's, I think, what we need. We really need all sorts of ways of improving the international organizations, and that's, there's no other way.
So if we can be innovative from the idea point of view, so what would be some of the suggestions you can make for both the governments in the US or in China or the global governance institutions as to strengthen the growth and also add stability to the world economy?
Well, let me make one comment which goes back to try to understand the fundamentals of why you need global governance, and it is about where there are cross-border externalities, cross-border effects. And one of the problems is that we've often tried to get regulation for purposes of special interest where there are very little cross-border effects, and we haven't done things about areas where there are cross-border effects. As I think about the various areas of cross-border effects, I think the two that Martin highlighted, climate change and nuclear proliferation, are of an order of magnitude more important than capital flows and trade flows.
And terrorism.
Now, it seems to me that at least in the area of climate change, there are things that one can do. It's an order of magnitude difference between what we did in Montreal with the ozone destroying gases and the greenhouse gases. But the Montreal Convention did impose trade sanctions on those countries that didn't fulfill their responsibilities, effectively whether they were signatories or not. And that seems to me that principle ought to apply in climate change. I think there needs to be an agreement among the I hate to use the term, but I think the coalition of the willing of those countries who are committed to climate change, and to say if any country doesn't do a reasonable job, and I would have some latitude of what that means, but a reasonable job in addressing their climate change, there will be trade sanctions. And there will be trade sanctions, particularly on those goods that are climate intensive, but I would go beyond that probably, because I think you have to incentivize. And that would change the internal dynamics, because even if the United States moves away from globalization, it will still be very deeply integrated into the global economy.
Well, thank you very much. So can we open for any questions from the floor, please? Any questions? Oh, there's one over there. That lady, please. Is there a microphone, a spare one, to give it to her? Oh, we can give one to her.
Thank you. As we've talked a lot about US and China, I want to ask 2 questions about EU. So first is, I'm wondering if you could share your expertise on how the Brexit bill is going to calculate it, and also the likely scenario of EU and the UK is going to be, because as the Brexit negotiation is coming soon. And the second question is about the way to go forward for EU, as the EU Commission has put forward like 5 scenarios of EU's future with different levels of integration. So I think Professor Stiglitz has wrote an article about a split euro, which I'm wondering if it is suggesting like the EU should be less integrated than it is now. So just basically the next...
Maybe we can ask Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Wolf to answer
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
Oh,
and
yes,
maybe
yes.
probably
Yep.
Mr. Roland as well.
Roland, please.
Thank you.
I think since we have a gentleman from Belgium, I'm going to be happy to leave him to the question of the future of the EU, since my country is leaving. I have lots of views on the future of the EU, and I would like to point out that 26 years ago, in 1991, I wrote a column, which I still think is probably the best column I ever wrote, saying that the euro would prove a catastrophic mistake. Now, I won't go further than that. We can discuss why I thought this. On Brexit, I'll just note on Brexit in 2 minutes. It was a catastrophically stupid decision, which we will regret. And we are carrying through a process of implementing it, which I predicted. That is to say, once we voted for Brexit, we would inevitably withdraw from the single market and almost certainly from the customs union. So even if there is an agreement between the UK and the EU on the divorce and the subsequent trading relationships, it will be a pretty hard Brexit, which will reduce significantly trade between the UK and the rest of the EU, and will, above all, fundamentally transform the relationship in the financial sector, which is very important to the UK. So that's point 1. Point 2 is, it's the only other point I will make, because otherwise you get the hour or 2-hour version of this. In my view, there is an extremely good chance, which I rate as significantly above 1 in 2, above 50%, that there will be no agreement between the UK and the EU. And this is partly because there is far too little time to reach agreement. The effective negotiating period will be closer to a year than 2 years. I won't have time to explain why, but that is, I think, the case. and it's partly because the negotiations are incredibly complex, covering an immense range of topics relating to the divorce, the subsequent long-term arrangement, and the transition. They're incredibly complex. And third, the politics on both sides are lousy. So I think there is a very good chance that no agreement whatsoever will be reached. If one is very optimistic, an agreement will be reached on the divorce, whose core will be that the UK will agree to pay a lot of money, which I advocate, and this is optimistic, and there will be agreement on a transition towards a final goal of a free trade agreement with some enhanced equivalence regime, a technical term which I won't have time to explain, on regulation, which would allow a fair amount of trade to continue. That transition will be very difficult to agree, but I think in that transitional period, the relationship for services will be very difficult, almost certainly be a period in which there is really a pretty brutal change. And that I remain of the view that the only sensible transition arrangement on goods is to stay in the customs union, which is unlikely. So I think the core assumption must be that there will be no deal within that period. And absolutely final point, there is a theoretical possibility of extending the negotiation period in the light, if it is clear we're not going to reach a deal. That requires unanimity on the EU side, and getting the 27 member countries to agree on the time of day is more or less impossible. So I think the chances of agreeing to such an extension, particularly given the nature of the current Polish and Hungarian governments, is effectively zero. So in sum, it's a complete disaster, and enjoy it from looking at it from outside.
So that will last forever on the process. Professor Roland, please.
So
how about the future of EU?
Well, in a way, you know, Brexit may actually, in the end, you know, prove benefits for the EU, and unfortunately the British will pay the price for it because but it's, you know, that's because it, you know, right now people are complaining about the EU, just like in the US people are complaining about globalization, but you know, if really protectionism happens, they'll see how bad that is, and I think with Britain leaving the EU, that will be particularly bad. I think it may convince a lot of people inside the EU that there are actually advantages to staying in the EU, even though there's very much status quo and there are very many problems. I think a big reason behind the crisis in the EU has to be to the fact how they manage the crisis. In particular, the Greek crisis is a very, very important example. It turns out that Germany, that's a key part of the EU, and so this morning we talked a little bit about Germany. Germany actually benefits a lot from the European Union because, you know, without the European Union, the Deutschmark would be much higher and their exports would not necessarily be that competitive. But they don't always see it that way. But there are really big problems in the sense that German economic policy, for historical reasons, whatever, they only think that inflation is the only danger. So if you have mass unemployment, they say, yeah, but inflation is around the corner. I mean, it really, that's the issue. And these misguided austerity policies have, you know, created misery, mass unemployment, not just in Spain, Greece, etc., but also have created this very contractionary, you know, situation in Europe. I don't see that changing very much in the near future. So it's only if world growth picks up again, you know, just a little bit of growth can help. Actually, 2-3% inflation might have helped a lot at the time, but it's just not happening. You have these anti-inflationary hawks, you know, and that's terrible. Apart from that, if the EU managed to survive the French and the German elections, and that will give time, because the Trump presidency is 4 years, so we have to see how that's going to be managed. But if they manage to survive that, they will still be seen as somehow, a place of peace and stability. And they're actually talking about China. There are possibilities. I say possibilities of actually increasing trade between EU and China. It could also be the other way. It could be that if there's protectionism on the Chinese side, it could be, followed by also protectionism on the European side. That should not be excluded. But there's certainly a silver lining to it. EU could improve its institutions. They have now an elected president of the Commission, but nobody knows it. Nobody knows it that Jean-Claude Juncker was actually elected president of the European Commission exactly in the same way like the German Chancellor is elected. So the previous election in the European Parliament, every single party had a European what they call Spitzenkandidat, the major candidate. They were all Germans, by the way, and the Conservatives won, and their candidate was Juncker. I mean, there's a lot to be said about the quality of Jean-Claude Juncker, but that's the way it is. Now, the EU is in constant transformation. One should not neglect the fact that to the outside, the EU is certainly very important in terms of democracy. If you live in Ukraine today, then the hope that someday Ukraine might join the EU is something really important. And the fact that Putin hates so much the EU does mean that it does serve something. So historically, the EU has helped Portugal, Spain, Greece, basically access to democracy. And the Central European countries that did access the European Union, did reform faster than otherwise, though we see now once they're in, the authoritarian tendencies then, arise. But these are challenges that they need to manage. Just like the refugee crisis, where there's a clear divide between the East Europeans who do not want to have a single refugee, and then countries like Germany, Sweden, mostly them, who have done the brunt of the job here, and Angela Merkel losing a lot of political capital for that. But despite her losing the capital, Martin Schulz, who was the president of the European Parliament, who is now the candidate of the Social Democrats, who's a clear pro-European, very popular in Germany, is winning a lot. So the anti-Europeans in Germany, not that strong.
Yeah, let me just elaborate on one part, which is the distinction between the euro and the eurozone and the EU. There are a number of countries, Sweden in particular, that is a member of the EU and not part of the euro. And my book on the euro talked about how that arrangement of sharing a common currency among 19 diverse countries was badly designed. So it wasn't just the policy. I mean, the policies of austerity were terrible. The structural policies that they imposed on countries like Greece were misplaced, misguided, made things worse. But the fundamental problem is that they took away a critical adjustment mechanism, the exchange rate and the interest rate. They didn't put anything in its place. And you get exchange rates that are misaligned. And Germany says the only way you can adjust the real exchange rate is for deflation, internal devaluation, rather than for a slight inflation expansion in the strong surplus countries like Germany. And that program is a disaster, and as Martin has written. And it, unfortunately, going back to the difficulty of getting the European leaders to agree, getting the Eurozone leaders to agree, in particular Germany, of the reforms in the structure of the Eurozone is very difficult or almost impossible I've been on panels where with officials of European Commission, and there'll be some discussion about what needs to be done, and somebody from the audience will ask a question. What hope for me as a young person is there going to be? We have, 30% unemployment, 25% or 45%. What hope do you have to offer? And somebody in the panel will say, well, these are the reforms you need. And he'll say, yes, you're right, but those are very difficult. And that is the answer. They all agree on what needs to be done. And then they say, well, the politics, you have to understand, are very difficult. Very little hope for those who don't have jobs.
Yes, Professor Lau.
Gerard mentioned China-EU cooperation. I actually want to say something about that, because I think it would be best for the UK and the EU, for other countries, to simply, not negotiate anything new until it's settled, right? And so that basically avoids gaming, on both sides. My proposal is actually, I made this proposal that anything that EU can get today, UK will get, okay, because it's still a member, right, until it exits. And then anything that, but the quid pro quo is that anything that EU gives, UK would also agree to give, okay, and so this will run until Brexit Day, and then the UK can decide at that day whether it wants to reopen any discussion or whether let the thing run on. I think that is really how create the environment that would be would enable the UK and the EU to try to come to some sort of agreement. Otherwise, if you have negotiation going all the time, with UK and China and then EU and China, I think that would be a mess. You'll never get to an agreement.
Okay, I may only leave the last few minutes to our two panelists, Mr. Yu and Mr. Sun. Oh, you have to leave. Yeah, okay, thank you so much, Mr. Wolf. So maybe you want to make a summary of some of your thoughts, Professor Sun and Mr. Yu, and then we will have to conclude our panel. Thank you.
I think when we talk about the EU or even the US, there's quite a lot of, when we talk about the global governance and all that, there's a lot of requests on China to be a responsible stakeholder. But on the other hand, the question after Trump, after Brexit, one might have to ask, is US a responsible stakeholder so far? And because with the problem initiated by Trump's inauguration, it seems all the problem that US are, let's say, use the word threatening the world system is from Trump. No, I don't think so. I think the threat has been there all the time, because the American has always been protectionist of its own thinking or its own interests. I think if there is a request for responsible stakeholder there, it should be all wrong. And I think the American would really need to think, with Trump being the awakening call, maybe it should talk about its own reform. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about China needs a lot of economic reform. I surely support that. But on the other hand, the speaker of that always give the impression that maybe they don't need the reform. And I'm quite surprised of that. I mean, and in fact, what is really needed is a lot of reform in the USA. And whether it's a currency position, whether it's on its trade position, whether it's a workers' policy. Somebody was talking this morning that the workers' situation is very competitive in the US. I do have some companies in the US. I must say that the protection in the US is a lot worse than in the UK, because I have a difficult time to restructure my company in UK, but I can fire anybody in the US whenever I want it. I can give them 1 hour's notice, and they're gone. And is that protection? I mean, sometimes I do question that. And as far as the wage and all that is concerned, same thing. Because when we fire somebody in the US, I don't need to pay anything, okay? But in the UK, we really have to work it out about a month before that. Do all the calculation, hire the lawyers, and finish all that, and then we have to do a lot of settlement. Now, when it comes to that, I think the idea about reform that the Americans keep projecting to the outside world, especially to China in the last many years, I think is correct. But it is incorrect in the sense that the American lacking the consciousness that it needs a lot of reform. And it's not only because Trump, it's also because, I mean, Obama's situation. We talked to Jack Liu earlier about AIIB. And why can't they do something about it? Now they talk about TPP, okay? I think the workers, the Obamacare, the infrastructure investment that Obama talks about before also, and I think quite a lot of that will need to have a lot of fresh thinking in the U.S. The role of the state, I think Professor Lau was speaking earlier, it is a very important subject. And yes, the state creates a lot of imbalances in the economy, that's for sure. But it does create some other kind of benefit. And so when we talk about the imbalances created by the state intervention, shouldn't we also examine the benefit it comes with? And we quite often use the idea about the political system, the democracy. But after we got people elected, or in the West, or after we appointed somebody in the East or in China, after that, actually, the competition starts. Who are the better leader? Who are the better guide? Who provides better guidance to the economy, to the livelihood, to the distribution of resources and benefit? I think in the past, at least I would say 20, 30 years, China might have won in terms of mathematics, in terms of statistical growth, in terms of alleviating poverty from a major sector of the economy. So I think there might be a sincere need to re-examine the blanket denial of the role of the role of the state in economic growth. And the blanket denial of that is a wrong starting point. And I sincerely hope that might be something that we need to look at.
Okay, finally, Professor, very briefly, please.
I think state play different roles. So we all have what we call ourselves multiple selves. So sometimes we have to think big. Talking about the economic growth, we have to, for example, some big issues on the gas and butters, how do you do the hearings to allocate the national resources. For example, if you can avoid some kind of a military competition, we can actually save trillions of dollars, put that kind of money into schools and infrastructure. So that is related to economic growth. But usually when I attended the economic forum, that is not topic, So, but when I attend the political forum, people talking about war and peace, but usually don't calculate how much does it cost for unification, for what kind of a competition, this kind of thing. So my suggestion is for political leaders, just remember, serve the people. That's the slogan everybody can accept, serve the people and use your political power in a smart way. That's my suggestion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Needless to say, we are in a historic big transition time. It's important to face the reality and give new thoughts of the existing status quo. So any thoughts, any reflections actually matter. And of course, as human beings, we helplessly be hopeful for the future because that matters to our very survival. So let's prepare for the worst, but still at the same time, keep our hope alive. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you very much, Anne Merritt. I want to give the floor back to you. Thank you.